Where are my notes? Here we go. There are two kinds of people in the world. There are cat people and there are dog people. Do we have, and frequently they marry one another. I don't know if you've noticed that. But I grew up a dog person, and I married a cat lover. And so far, we've been at a stalemate all these years. We're waiting to see how the kids shake loose. We're hoping that I'm, trying to persuade them over to the dog side, and she's trying to lull them over into heresy. And big difference between cats and dogs, though. Dogs basically say, this is the way a dog looks at the world. Dog says, well, you provide for me, and you love me, and you pet me, and you care for me, and you let me outside when I need to go outside, and you bring me back in right when I need to come back in. You do all this stuff for me. You must be God. And a cat says the same thing, except the cat says, you love me, and you pet me, and you provide for me, and you care for me. I must be God. Big difference between cats and dogs there. When we started this class like a year and a half ago, were any of you here when we started the first class? So there have been babies born and people have graduated. It's just crazy when we started this whole class. We started, and in one of the very first classes I taught, I introduced this phrase to you. And we've come back to it several times over the course of the last year and a half. And the phrase is ontological dualism. And it sounds very impressive when you say it, and it makes people think you're a lot smarter than you actually are. At least that's been my experience. And but it's a very important phrase for us to really get our arms around because it explains so much once we really get a good understanding of what ontological dualism means. Basically, it means there are two categories of things. Two categories of things that exist. And everybody believes that. Our problem is we tend to draw the line vertically instead of horizontally. And so we draw it between separate things that have been created. And so we say there are spiritual things and there are non-spiritual things. There are church things and there are not church things. And that's where we tend to draw the boundary. But that's a false boundary. Really, there are two categories of things that exist, but the line doesn't need to be drawn up and down. It needs to be drawn sideways, horizontally, because the two categories of things that exist are God and not God. And that's very important for us to understand. There is God and there is not God. And so no matter what goes on in your life, it's important for you to ask, which category does this fall into? Your problems, is that God or is that not God? The situations that arise that create anxiety or produce fear in you. Is this God or is it not God? Because if it's not God, then God is bigger than it and God can overcome it. You see, it's very, very important for us to get a good feel for the two categories of things that exist in our universe. There is God and there is not God. 15 years ago, a man named Ernest Kurtz wrote the definitive history of the organization Alcoholics Anonymous. And the title of that book, is anybody familiar with this book? The title of the book is Not God. Because that's one of the fundamental phrases that organization uses. In fact, he says that's the first thing the organization teaches people is to say, I'm not God. And he says that's the hardest thing for addicts to realize, to recognize that they are not God. In fact, this is a quote from the introduction. He says, the fundamental and first message of Alcoholics Anonymous to its members is that they are not infinite, not absolute, not God. Every alcoholic's problem had first been, according to this insight, claiming godlike powers, especially that of control. But the alcoholic, at least, this message insists, is not in control, not even of himself. And the first step towards recovery from alcoholism must be admission and acceptance of this fact that is so blatantly obvious to others, but so tenaciously denied by the obsessive-compulsive drinker. Historically, it has been the concept of divinity, the notion of the deity that includes the idea of absolute control. The program of Alcoholics Anonymous then teaches first and foremost that the alcoholic is not God. Later on, he goes on to say, but Alcoholics Anonymous is fellowship as well as program, and thus there's a second side to its message of not godness. Because the alcoholic is not God, not absolute, not infinite, he or she is essentially limited. Yet from this very limitation, from the alcoholic's acceptance of personal limitation, arises the beginning of healing and wholeness. I am not God. And that's the problem with me is I'm real good at reminding other people that they're not God. This is just my default setting is to look around and remind other people, you're not God, you're not that important. Have you ever been in this situation where you're stuck in traffic, like on 400, and you're kind of in that outside lane, and you see somebody coming up the shoulder? You know what my first tendency is? You know what I want to do? I just want to nose out in the shoulder a little bit. Is it just me, or is it okay? So, and the reason why I want to do that is I want to say to them, hey, we've all got to wait. You can wait too. You're not God. You're not the center of the universe. See, I'm really good at reminding people. Most of the problems in my marriage come because one of us thinks she's God, and and I am just too quick to remind her that she is not God. See, I look for opportunities to remind other people, you're not God. I'm really good at reminding other people that they're not God. And it feels good to tell other people that, especially someone that you kind of catch, and if you can bust them on this one, oh, it feels so good. In fact, turn to the person next to you and tell them they're not God. Oh, it feels so good. We're all giggly and laughing. Oh, this feels great. So you just don't need to argue about this. You don't need to argue about it. It just feels so good to tell other people, to remind them. My problem is that while I'm very good at reminding other people, I'm not always very good at being told that. Because while it feels good to say it to other people, it doesn't always feel good when somebody says it back to you. Well, you're not either. Well, shut up. I mean, there's no response to that at that point in time. I'm not very good at being told that I'm not God. But the reality is, I desperately, desperately need people, at least some other person who is brave enough to periodically put their finger in the middle of my chest and say, hey, you are not God. So important for me to be in community, in authentic relationships with people who are not afraid to remind me periodically, you're not the center of the universe. One of the things we talked about last week was when you live in a foreign land, when you live in Babylon, you can't go through life on your own. Daniel seeks out community. He's got these 3 other friends, and they go through life together. It's so important that we do this because we all tend to forget that I'm not God. And we need other people who will say that sometimes gently and sometimes very forcefully, but always in a posture of love and service to remind us, you're not God. Look at Daniel chapter 2. If you have a copy of the Old Testament, open up to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2, verse 1 says, in the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. Any of you have trouble sleeping? I have struggled with insomnia since I was an adolescent, and it doesn't happen very often anymore. It happened a lot when I was a teenager. But I still struggle with it periodically. And according to some research I looked up today, 62% of Americans have some difficulty sleeping. In fact, did anybody see there was a special report on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News or one of those last night talking about how many sleeping pills people take now because their work level is so heavy, and they come home and they're so anxious about their work, and they check their email late at night, and so they never unplug, and so then they get in bed and can't unwind and can't unplug and can't turn it off, and so they take sleeping pills. And sleeping pills now promote fewer and fewer negative side effects than they have before, but people just can't sleep. So what they end up doing is they take sleeping pills and they get up in the morning and they have to drink a pot of coffee, in order to kind of wake up and get going, and our health is just kind of unraveling on us, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that we have trouble sleeping. And I'll tell you, something happened for me several years ago. There was a guy named Don Finto. Some of you may know Don. And Don and I were talking about this because Don struggles with this as well, or at least he used to. And he said, for me, when I have trouble sleeping, what I do is pray. Because there's usually something occupying my mind that's keeping me awake. And so what I've decided and what I've learned is if I can take whatever that is that keeps my wheels spinning at night, take that and pray about it, usually my level of anxiety goes down, and I find myself asleep before I even realize it. See, some of you thought, it's a bad thing if I fall asleep while I'm praying, but that actually could be a good side effect, Really, listen, this is why I bring this up. What do I do when I forget that I'm not God? See, if I think that I'm God, I would never say it that way, but if I begin to act as if I'm God, then who am I going to take my problems to? I'm going to take them to me, right? Because you take your problems to God, and so I take my problems to me, and I talk to myself, and I keep myself awake. I mean, that's just it makes so much sense. But if I can remember, wait a second, I'm not God. There's somebody else I can take this to. There's somebody else who said, hey, I'll stay awake, okay? There's no sense in both of us staying awake for this. I'm going to be up anyway. Why don't you let me take that? You see? And so if I can remember I'm not God, I can take my problems to Him, and then I can relax, okay? Now, in this chapter, what we're going to find out is Nebuchadnezzar's problem is he thinks he's God. Okay? Now, it says there in that first verse, it says in the second year of his reign. So Nebuchadnezzar has been king for a year, or more than a year now. Assyria, who's their main competitor, collapsed about 5 years prior to this. So what that means is there's no competition for him. He is the undisputed, unrivaled, unchallenged heavyweight champion of the world. He's the most powerful guy in the world at this point in time. He's young, he's rich, he's powerful. I must be God. That's what he's saying to himself. I must be God, and yet he can't sleep. Now see, there's a difference between choosing not to sleep, which is what God does, and not being able to sleep. Because if God wanted to, he could go to sleep. Jesus proved that in the middle of a storm. Go down in a boat, fall asleep. Waves rocking the boat up like that. The sailors think, we're dying out here, and he's asleep. So clearly, Jesus can fall asleep if he wants to. There's a difference between choosing not to sleep and not being able to sleep. And Nebuchadnezzar cannot sleep. This is kind of a strange kind of God who has insomnia. Okay? And so what does he do? He calls for experts. Verse 2. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. And when they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I've had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. And I want you to see something about the kinds of people that Nebuchadnezzar has surrounded himself with. Because remember, I just said it's important for you to get around some people who will remind you periodically you're not God. Look what they say. Verse 4. Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic. By the way, we'll come back to that in a little bit, that little phrase. But they say, O king, live forever. That's not real helpful at that point in time. O king, you're God, you're immortal, you're brilliant, and all that kind of stuff. That he's surrounded himself with people who will reinforce this crazy idea, you're God. And so if you think about it, Nebuchadnezzar, this is kind of what the world looks like for Nebuchadnezzar. The world does not look like my backside erasing a board, but this is what the world looks like. This is Nebuchadnezzar. And we'll know it's Nebuchadnezzar because he has a crown. There. Okay, so that's Nebuchadnezzar. And everything in the world is about him. Everything. He's the center of everything. Everything, it's all about him. Matt Elliott. Do you know who Matt Elliott is? Matt Elliott's a worship leader at Campus Church over in Norcross. And Matt sent me a link the other day to this. It's a spoof video, and it looks like a worship CD commercial that you would see on television late at night. And it's this guy, and he's sitting at a piano, and he's playing all these familiar worship songs that you would know if you heard them, but he's changed all the words, and so he's singing, it's all about me, Jesus, and he's singing, oh, come, let us adore me, oh, come, let us, it's really, really funny. But that's kind of what Nebuchadnezzar is doing here. Everything is about me. You exist for my sake, and the world exists to bring me pleasure and comfort, and that's really what Nebuchadnezzar sees the world as. That's the lens through which he interprets everything. Look at verse 5. The king replied to the astrologers, "This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was," because apparently he's forgotten what the dream was, he just knew that it troubled him, so you have to tell him what it was too. "If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble." And the Hebrew word for rubble is dung, actually. So not only will I tear your house down, but then I'll make it a public toilet as well. I'm not making that up. Verse 6, "But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me." And this is one of those situations where your boss's dream becomes your worst nightmare. Anybody ever been there? Now, once more they replied, verse 7, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and then we'll interpret it." The king answered, "I am certain you're trying to gain time." He's like all weird and paranoid. You're just stalling now. When I was a kid, I used to listen to these comedy records, and which explains a lot, I guess. But they would try to explain the theory of comedy, in a level that kids could understand. And so one of the jokes that they would tell as an example of a bad joke is one of the characters would say to the other, "What's the difference between?" And the other character would say, "Between what?" No hints. I'm not going to give it away. You have to, and that's kind of, so that's what the king is saying here. Tell me my dream. I can't tell you your dream. I'll interpret it after. But the king said, "No, you're trying to gain time because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there's just one penalty for you. You have conspired." He's got a whole conspiracy theory cooked up now. "You've conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things." And these poor magicians are thinking, we just wanted to tell, we don't even know what you're talking about. "You've conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change." What situation? He's so irrational. Lack of sleep will do that to you. Lack of peace will do that to you. "So then, tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me." The astrologers answered the king, "There's not a man on earth who can do what the king asks." And you know what? They're right. So we'll get to that in a second. "No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men." What a frustrating worldview that is. But one of the things that is a sign of maturity, and a sign of mature leadership especially, is what psychologists and educators call having a high frustration tolerance. Being able to deal with frustration is actually a sign of maturity. And having a low frustration tolerance is a sign of immaturity. For example, if one of my girls is trying to put together a puzzle, and it just gets hard for her, she'll just tear the whole thing up. She may get halfway through it and not be able to finish it, and rather than take a deep breath, let's figure this out, instead, she'll flip the whole thing over. Now, is that mature behavior or immature behavior? So we understand not being able to tolerate any frustration is a sign of immaturity. Well, look at this next verse, and you tell me, if the king has high or low frustration tolerance. This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. Not real good at handling frustration here. And here's something else that kind of stood out to me as I was reading this today. When I forget that I'm not God, innocent people get hurt. People who didn't even do anything get hurt because I have assumed a role I'm not created to fill. All the wise men of Babylon now have to be afraid just because the king forgot he's not God. Look at verse 13. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. Daniel and his friends don't know anything that's going on. They're minding their own business. All of a sudden there's a knock on the door. Daniel, we're here to kill you. Well, why? Well, the king had this dream and these guys, and I don't know, it was kind of crazy, but we have to kill you now. Very, very difficult. Jesus was a master teacher, and I can't wait. I've kind of outlined, Sherry Hill and I were talking about this earlier, I've kind of outlined a plan where we'll get through the rest of the Old Testament here in a little bit, and we'll start in on the life of Jesus this summer. And I'm really already looking forward to it, because I think Jesus was not only Son of God, not only sinless, perfect lifestyle, not only sacrificial lamb, died for the sins of the world. Jesus was also the smartest man who ever lived. I'm just convinced of that. Absolutely brilliant, and was a magnificent teacher. And one of the things that he did to mature his disciples was what a theologian named Walter Wink calls intentionally induced frustration. He's always asking the disciples to do crazy things. Hey, Jesus, see all these people out here, they're getting kind of restless. We should probably knock off so they can go get lunch. And Jesus says, you feed them. There are 5,000 of them, Jesus. We don't have any food. Well, what do you got? We got a couple of fish and some bread. Pass that out. Jesus, there's this father, he brought his son, and his son has a demon, and the demon keeps throwing his son in the fire, trying to kill him. Well, cast the demon out. Can we do that? I don't know. Can we? He's always asking them to do things that frustrate them. And that's part of growing up. Being able to sort of submit to things that frustrate you, knowing there's no way I can accomplish this in my own strength. But also knowing that through the process, God is going to grow me up. God calls me to raise my kids, and I don't have the resources to do that. Only God can parent my kids, but He calls me to do it. Because He knows that in the process, I'll come out the other end looking more like Him than I went into it. God intentionally induces frustration in us to shape our character. So, maybe one of the best things you can do is the next time you find yourself frustrated, just remind yourself, I'm not God. Tomorrow when you're at work and something happens and you find your blood pressure starting to, just remind yourself, I'm not God. Stuck in traffic, somebody starts creeping up the side of I'm not God. You go to the grocery store, you're in the express lane, and there's somebody with 16 items and a fistful of coupons, and they try to pay with a two-party out-of-state check and no ID. You just remind yourself, I'm not God. The universe doesn't revolve around me. Maybe that's one of the best things we can do is leave this place reminding ourselves that let that just be your mantra. I'm not God. I'm not God. The world doesn't revolve around me. Now, what we're going to see here with Nebuchadnezzar is he demonstrates a lot of characteristics of burnout. He's been on the job a little more than a year, and I actually looked at symptoms of burnout from a psychologist's website today. Symptoms of burnout include negative emotions, frustration, relational withdrawal. I would say ordering the execution of all that would count as relational withdrawal to me. Interpersonal problems, that would count too, towards that. Aggression, irritability, hostile or suspicious behavior, fear, anxiety. Those are all symptoms of burnout. And you know what I've realized is burnout rarely has to do with work level or workload. It has more to do with you trying to do something you're not equipped to do. Because you can sustain a heavy workload for a long time, but you can't if you're being called or asked to do something you're not equipped to do. And Nebuchadnezzar is not equipped to be the center of the universe. And the longer he lives that way, the more frustrated he's going to become. The higher his anxiety level is going to raise. And the more symptoms of burnout he's going to experience. So Nebuchadnezzar has all these negative circumstances, and he calls on his advisors. And his advisors, if you go back to verse 10, you'll see that their worldview is different than Nebuchadnezzar's. Verse 10, the astrologers answered the king, there's not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and unfortunately, they don't live among us. So if this is Nebuchadnezzar's view of the world, here are the advisors over here. We'll do the advisors like that, and we'll know they're the advisors because they have a beard. And a funny hat. There. Okay. That just looks like a chicken. Okay. Oh, wait. This is what I want to do. Okay. This is how they view the world. They're down here on earth. There are gods, but there's a boundary, a fixed boundary. And every time they try to get up there, they're frustrated. They can't. They can't get up there. There's a fixed boundary between them and the gods. And try as hard as they cannot jump that high. Their arms are not long enough to reach through and get over to where the gods live. What a frustrating existence this is. Because you know somebody is out there who has the answers, but I just can't get to them. And what's really weird is it leads to the same kind of thing in both situations. Because over here, Nebuchadnezzar gets to be God. Over here, the wise men have to be God. Because there's nobody else to go to. Over here, Nebuchadnezzar gets to have the last word. Over here, the wise men have to have the last word. Because the gods aren't talking. The gods are way beyond the azure blue. They spoke a long, long time ago. See, you remember that? You know that song? Most of you know that song. It's like the Church of Christ pep rally song. You got to stand up every time you sing it. Somebody sent me I think it was in the Christian Chronicle or something like that, like a top 10, or you might be a member of the Church of Christ if thing. And one of them was, if you know what song I'm referring to, if I just say 728B. Right, see, now, I have a love-hate relationship with this song. It's a lot of fun to sing, you know. And there are parts of the song that I really, really like, especially the chorus. There is a God, He is alive, in Him we live and we survive. From dust our God created man. He is our God, the great I am. I love that. But the song starts with this idea that there's a God who is way beyond the azure blue. He's concealed from human sight. He did all this stuff a long time. There was a long, long time ago a God whose voice the prophets heard, but we don't hear him anymore, except through the Bible? That's not true. Yes, he speaks through his word. He also speaks through the inner witness of the Spirit, through the collected wisdom of his body. He speaks in a lot of different ways. See, if we only buy the verse and not the chorus, then we're in trouble with that song, you see? Because then we're into this place here. There's a God way up there, but there's a gap between us, and I'll never be able to reach into it. And so no one can help me in this difficult situation except the gods, and they don't live among us. How frustrating that is. Both of those views of the world, you end up being totally preoccupied with yourself. Because you have to be the measure of all things. You have to be the final arbiter. All I can see is me, and the problem is I'm not designed to be the center of the universe. I'm not designed to have the final word on things. I'm not designed to be the one around whom everything revolves. Neither am I designed to be alone in the universe. Neither of those can be right. And you experience the same symptoms, the same results. High anxiety, fear, hostile or suspicious behavior, irrational behavior. And think about poor Daniel. Look at verse 13. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put him to death. Life can change so quickly. Remember where we left them at the end of last week? They'd had this great triumph. They'd refused the king's food, and it had all worked out well, and God had given them wisdom and insight and all kinds of understanding, and they changed the diet of everybody to make it more like Daniel and his friends. I mean, they're really on the fast track to the top. And now, all of a sudden, through no fault of their own, through circumstances they have no control over, somebody knocks on the door and says, I hate to tell you this, but you're going to need to come with us. And look at how Daniel responds to this. This is amazing. Verse 14. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. Wow. What do you mean you're going to kill me? I didn't do anything wrong. You're violating my civil rights. He spoke to him with wisdom and with tact. There's no panic. There's no fear in this. I mean, I'm sure he felt fear, but the approach that he took was with wisdom and tact. And what does he do? What does wisdom say? Look at verse 15. He asked the king's officer a question. Why did the king issue such a harsh decree? And then, you know what he does after he asks a question? This is the big thing. He listens. And he lets Arioch then explain the matter. I was listening in the radio on my way in. There's a documentary that's coming on PBS this month on the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Bonhoeffer was an amazing man. And one of the things that he wrote in a book called Life Together, he says that the first duty that a Christian owes to his fellow man is the duty to listen. He says the way we show our love for God is by listening to His Word, and the way we show our love to other people is by listening to their words. And he says, if you stop listening to other people, it won't be long before you stop listening to God. He asks a question, and then he listens. James says, be quick to listen and slow to speak, and then you'll be slow to get angry. One of the 7 habits of highly effective people: seek first to understand and then to be understood. Because of Daniel's wisdom and tact, because he listens, he can form a plan. Look at verse 16. At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Now, here's a question. Where do you turn when you're frustrated? Nebuchadnezzar turns to his advisors turn to themselves, and they just end up more frustrated. Daniel, where does Daniel turn? Everyone says God. Everyone jumps right to God. Who does he turn to? His friends. He goes to his friends first. This is the power of community, and together, collectively, then they turn to God. This is what the body of Christ is supposed to be. When you turn to the church, to your Christian friends, then together we all turn to God. It's interesting, the sequence here, though. Verse 17, then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And he urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. And during the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. And then this great hymn of praise goes through these next several verses. And he praises God. And then go to verse 24. Daniel goes and he finds Arioch. Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, don't execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I'll interpret his dream for him. Now, I want you to see, Daniel sought Arioch out. Okay? Now, verse 25. Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dream means. He's kind of spinning the story a little bit. King, I've searched high and low, and it wasn't easy, but I am the can-do guy around here, and I had to go out to the exiles from Judah, and I finally found one. Daniel came to him. Oh, this is crazy. I found a guy. Now contrast that with Daniel's humility. Okay, verse 26. The king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? Daniel replied, this is great, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he is asked about, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Isn't that great? He refuses to take credit. I can't tell you what your dream is or interpret it. I'm not that smart. But I do know somebody. There is a God, and he is out there, but he doesn't stay out there. He intercedes. He intervenes. He interjects himself into our world, into time and space, history. And Daniel refuses to take the credit. Look at verse 36. Jump down to verse 36. This is great. He goes through, he explains the dream, and then he says, this was the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. We? You see that? We. This is meant to not to him and God, he's got his friends with him. Because how did he get the interpretation of the dream? His friends were praying for it. A whole group gathers together and prays. One guy gets the dream and its interpretation, but he refuses to take credit for it. Rather, he says, we did this. The group did this. The credit belongs to the group. In fact, if you go down to verse 49, it says, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon. He shares the credit with his friends. I just love that about Daniel's heart. Because see, listen, if I'm not God, then I can share credit with other people. But if I have to be the center of the universe, then I'm going to hoard that. Now he gives the interpretation of the dream in verse 31. You looked, O king, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. He wants you to know that all this power is mixed, and at the bottom it's got feet of clay. And all of this power is vulnerable. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. One of these days, All of that power is going to come tumbling down because of its vulnerability. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken to pieces at the same time and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. And this was the dream, and now we'll interpret it to the king. You, O king, are the King of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he's placed mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. Wherever you live, he's made you ruler over them all. You are that head of gold. And Nebuchadnezzar probably thought, hey, I like this dream so far. That's pretty good. But after you, another kingdom, or it could be translated another ruler. And people get hung up on like which, they look at all the different medals and say, oh, that was this empire or that was this ruler. And I think we can waste a lot of time doing that. The text doesn't say that, and so let's just deal with kind of what the text says. Another kingdom will rise, inferior to yours. And next a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks everything to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. And just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture, and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. And this is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and the interpretation is trustworthy. Daniel sees another. Daniel sees things differently. Daniel says, I'm down here. But you know what? I'm just one of many. There are a lot of other folks. And there is a God who is up there. But there is not a fixed chasm between us. Instead, this God relates to us. Relates to all of us. And because he relates to all of us, he allows us to relate to each other. And we're back to what God was starting to do from the very beginning. Create a community of people. A kingdom that would never end. A kingdom that was rightly related to him and rightly relating to each other. And I'm just one of those people, Daniel says. I can't even take credit for all this stuff. The only reason I know it is because I have a relationship with God. And the only reason he revealed it to me is because I was rightly relating to other people at the time. We're back to what God was doing at the very beginning, building his community. And this promise, he says, is sure. And it's going to happen in the future. And it's going to destroy all the other kingdoms of the earth. And this one will never end. And it'll never be given to other people. In other words, you know what Daniel says is, I'm not God, but I know him. I'm not God, but I'm his friend. I'm his son. And that's the promise of the new covenant. That you can say, I'm not God, but I have a relationship with him. And because I have that relationship with him, I can relax. Because I have this relationship with him and I know he's in control, I know that I'm not God, I can calm down. I can stop worrying. If I'm not God, I can be really, really bold. I mean, what Daniel did required a lot of boldness. I was thinking about this on the way in again. Dietrich Bonhoeffer stood up to the most powerful man in Europe, to Adolf Hitler. When all the other churches were going along with it, Bonhoeffer said, this isn't right. This is wrong. It's morally corrupt. It's evil. And that eventually cost him his life. But he said, if I have to give my life for this, I'm okay with that. Because, hey, look, I'm not God. And if I'm not God, but I do know Him, I can be amazingly bold. Because Daniel is so amazingly bold, look at what Nebuchadnezzar does. Verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings, for you were able to reveal this mystery. Now, he doesn't become this great hero of faith at this point in time. But Daniel is amazingly bold here. And Daniel says, I can be bold as long as I remember I'm not God. And remember I talked about earlier the wise men answer the king in Aramaic? And I said we'd cut back to that. Something interesting happens here. Some of you probably have a footnote in your text that says this. The next 6 chapters of the book of Daniel were actually written in Aramaic, which is very bizarre because nothing had been written in Aramaic up until that point. Everything had been written in Hebrew. I think the reason it's written in Aramaic, I mean, could you imagine if you open a novel and you're reading through the novel and all of a sudden there are 6 chapters in French? It would just be strange, right? So I think what the author of the book is trying to reveal is God speaks a lot of different languages. God's not just the God of the Hebrews. God's God of Jerusalem, and God is the God of Samaria, and God is the God of Babylon, and God is the God of Rome, and God is the God of Athens, and God is the God of Washington, D.C., and New York City, and London, and Tokyo, and Amsterdam, and Atlanta, and Alpharetta. God is a God who speaks a lot of different languages, and I'm just one. But if I'm in a right relationship with Him, I can relax, and I can be incredibly, incredibly bold, and I can stop worrying. Verse 48. Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. And now is when you'd expect that big hymn of praise to come. But it doesn't come here. Where does it come? It comes back up in verse 20, in the middle of the story, when Daniel didn't know that this was going to have a happy ending, when things were still uncertain, when Daniel's life was still at risk and he hadn't been pardoned and he hadn't been elevated. He said, now I'm going to praise God. Because when you realize I'm not God, I'm not the center of the universe, you can relax. Because you know, what's the worst thing that can happen to me? Apostle Paul says, can anything separate us from the love of God? No. Height, depth, high, low, loud, soft, angels, demons. What's the worst thing you can imagine? It can't separate you from the love of God. And as long as you have that, I can go through life without all the anxiety. I can sleep at night. I can relate to other people. I can share credit because I'm not God. And that certainty comes in the midst of uncertain circumstances. So this week, that's going to be my challenge to you. To relax and be brave and remind yourself that you're not God. Let's pray. God, we thank you for being God. Because for me personally, I would do a terrible job. I'm not equipped to be God, to be the center of the universe. And anytime I try to fill that role, I end up hurting innocent people. I end up with high anxiety. I end up with high levels of frustration. I end up angry and burnt out. And God, we also thank you that you have not chosen to remain in isolation, utterly transcendent, but that you have chosen to intersect with our lives in real ways, that you communicate with us, that you live with us, that through your indwelling Holy Spirit, for those of us who are in Christ Jesus, you live in us. God, we thank you for being God and for knowing us, for calling us into relationship with you, for calling us out of darkness and transporting us into the kingdom of light. And God, I just pray that as we leave this place, we'll be convinced of that more than ever before. And as a result of that, we can live lives that are free of anxiety, free of worry, and that we can be brave. Brave enough to share you with people who we might think would be hostile towards you. Brave enough to stand up for what's right even when no one else does. Brave enough to do what it is you've called us to do in our generation. And we pray all of this in the name of the person who typified all of this. And his name is Jesus. And in him we say, amen.